Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. This is Dr. Nelson Ogunshakin, the CEO of FIDIC. I am delighted to welcome you all to this particular webinar where we are looking at the role of the infrastructure in achieving net zero world. This subject is very topical. It's not too long ago. We have the G7 meeting and discussing how the world is going to come together and resolve the issue about decarbonizing our industry and the world. Today, we have an opportunity to have some expert panel to share with us their thoughts on the subject, how those infrastructure impact and actually have a key role in achieving net zero. In our usual manner, we're delighted to have so many expert panel. Just going through our historical plan, we've had over 26 webinars so far, with nearly 20,000 people that register, with over 11,500 people participated. From that's nearly 150 countries. And looking through our YouTube recently, I'm extremely amazed about the number of people who's gone back to actually watch the video on YouTube, but it just confirmed that the topics we are covering are very, very relevant. Today's subject is very relevant. We all know about that. But just looking back through some of the headlines from the previous meetings we've had, we now know that it's going to be a new normal, working practices, and that life will never be the same as what it used to be. Communication is critical. We are now using technology in how we convey our message out. But that communication is not really about external communication. It's both internal. How do you communicate within your staff, within your team? There is the issue about the economic impact of COVID-19. It's reckoned between 1 to 2 trillion impact globally. What does that mean for the industry against the backdrop of achieving net zero? We'll be talking about that. The issue about investment profile of financier and government will change. There is a big shift. I hear the word into housing, healthcare, and green agenda. And I also hear the issue about how do we decarbonize our industry and in the future. There is also the issue that impacts our people. How do we deal with people in terms of our well-being? The key issue about surviving, consultancy and engineering sector, what role can we play in driving infrastructure, both in short term and in even medium to long term? And how does risk on pandemic actually impact the decision we make on infrastructure in future? These are key points that came out of it. There was always the issue about collaboration in the industry and how do we need to work together as an industry between various stakeholders, client, government, partners, supply chain, consultant. These are very critical. Also the issue about contract. There is always issue about contract. How do we deal with contract that is being sort of a mothballed and issue that's being frustrated? And more important, just to try and sum up, I think the key message that came through was that it doesn't matter who you are in the industry, be it very, very large or very, very small, we are all not going to be immune from the impact of technology. That takes us really to the point of how do we look at the subject for this particular year. We started the program this year looking at 3 themes where we look at our committees. We need to take our committees output into the world, make sure that people are really, really up to speed on the issues our committees are dealing with. And today's subject is really about our committee that I will introduce the speakers and the panelists later. So we're looking at our committee's activities, and we've got the next one coming up on 29th of June. We are also looking at the state of the world and looking at what is happening in the world and the big issue. We've introduced 2 reports already, one on infrastructure investment, the other one is about water, and we've got a few more coming up towards the end of the year, including a focused one on net zero. In addition to that, we are looking at our COVID issue. What is happening in the issue of COVID? How is it impacting different parts of the world? And how do we get our message across? So without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce FIDIC President, who is being championing this particular transformation in FIDIC. And we've done 26, 27 webinar. He hasn't missed any yet, considering it's about 6 o'clock in where he is in the United States. So it's my pleasure really to introduce Bill Howard. Bill, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nelson, for that kind introduction. First of all, I would like to congratulate and thank you and your very talented secretariat for putting these webinars together. As you mentioned, we've done 26 over the last year and a half or so, and they'd be a challenge under any circumstances. Certainly during a pandemic, they're even more challenging. And so far, we have put together really fantastic webinars, and they've been extremely well attended. In addition to your effort and the effort of the Secretariat, these webinars would be nowhere near as successful if it wasn't for our talented speakers. And once again, we have a group of about 6 speakers today, experts in this challenging area of the role of infrastructure industry in achieving net zero. So I'm looking forward to a very lively webinar on this very, very important subject to all of us. While all of us have a role in achieving net zero, within FIDIC, perhaps the committee that we look at the most to help us in this area and help our stakeholders is our Sustainable Development Committee. So many of our speakers today are from that committee, led by Tracy Ryan. So thank you very much to that committee for helping us. Engineers, in my view, can and should do a lot to bring us cost effectively to net zero using innovation. Engineers over the years have contributed a great deal to making the world a better place and a healthier place for that matter. But we all acknowledge there's been challenges resulting from a lot of those efforts. And engineers do have the ability to help the world deal with those challenges. I personally am an environmental engineer, so my focus over my career has been on water. So I wanted to mention very quickly a few examples that I think tie to the whole theme of getting to net zero. And again, they're focused on the water area. Perhaps the most important one, certainly the broadest one, is the consideration of water as a resource to be used and reused again, and not something to be used one time, treated, and then discharged maybe to an ocean or a lake or whatever. But the more we can reuse water, the more we are taking steps in that sustainable development world. In the same vein, stormwater can be managed and is in fact being managed locally in many, many areas to enhance water supply and quality in places all over the world. And examples of wastewater, for example, being treated to drinking water standards are beginning to show all over the world as well. To treat the wastewater to drinking water standards, to enhance water supply and quality. And those are just 3 of the areas in the environmental engineering world that are examples of things that engineers can and have been doing to bring us to net zero. And it's very important that we as FIDIC, in addition to acknowledging the problem and the challenges of getting to net zero, that we let the world know and remind the world about all of the great things that engineers do, because we really can play a much bigger and much better role in achieving net zero. So those are the kind of remarks that come to mind to me as an environmental engineer on the net zero challenge. So with that as an overview, I'd like to turn it back to you, Nelson, who will introduce our participants.
Thank you very much for that. It's actually very good to see the president taking his area of specialism as a topical area to give us a very microscopic view about how does engineer deliver net zero using water as a resource and as water that can be reused and reused again. It goes without saying that the subject is very topical. I used the word G7 just met. The whole world is looking about how do we move from hydrocarbon into, sort of a, clean energy, renewable, and all this is a big issue. And very soon there will be a COP26 coming up where the debate is going to be open. And I'm sure Tracy and our team is going to be very involved. So it is really my pleasure at this point in time to introduce Tracy Ryan from New Zealand. She is the Managing Director of Oracle in New Zealand. I was delighted, to engage with Tracy about a year and a half ago, and she's come on board leaps and bounds as the chair of our new reform Sustainability Development Group, and she's doing a fantastic job. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Tracy, who is going to take us through the 1 hour, 20-minute session of interactive engagement. Tracy, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Nelson. And tēnā koutou katoa, haramai, and welcome, as Nelson said and Bill said, to this FIDIC Committee's series. And we're delighted to be joining you tonight talking about clearly a very relevant topic. And just to set the scene a little bit, there is a poll. We're going to do 2 poll questions, so you will get time to vote, but you'll probably see one here and we'll do one later on. But we are keen for a very active participation in this. So the question does ask, to what extent does the role of the infrastructure industry play to achieving a net zero world? Should we be leading the charge? Should we be supporting policymakers? Should we be influencing others? All of the above, or maybe none. So if you want to take some time to answer that we'd really appreciate that. Just to kind of set the scene a little bit before I introduce our panelists, I suppose taking a step back and ultimately what the world is experiencing, we have seen over the last 18 months, the challenges of a global pandemic. But as we know, climate change remains the most urgent priority for governments and communities around the globe. And if we recap back into 2015, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, otherwise known as COP21, or the Paris Agreement, set out ambitions for pursuing a global temperature rise of just 1.5 degrees centigrade above pre-industry levels, and increasing climate adaptation ability and making financial flows consistent with low carbon and climate resilient development. And notably, the Paris Agreement sets out to achieve a balance between the source and sinks of greenhouse gases in the second half of the 21st century. And this is interpreted as reaching net zero emissions from 2050 onwards. And in some countries, this has been translated into national legally binding targets. And we're probably about to hear some of that from some of our speakers today. But decarbonisation economies to combat the negative impact of climate change is going to require the best thinking from all our industries. And we've heard Bill mention innovation. We'll probably talk a little bit about digital technologies and things like that. But it's going to require the engineering world, science, data and digital, financing and policy and primary production to truly come together in a highly collaborative way. So this webinar today will look at the pivotal role of the infrastructure industry in terms of what we play and how we will in achieving a net zero world. It is clear that without action and international action today, that adapting to the impacts of climate change in the future will be more difficult and costly. And again, I imagine some of our speakers will touch on that. Engineering infrastructure is known for its longevity and durability, and many engineering assets are built without fully defined lifespan, recognizing that they may be utilized for generations to come. These characteristics draw from the materials and techniques applied in engineering design, which are both a curse, but also a blessing in the context of carbon emissions and adaptability to climate change. As a result of the highly embodied carbon emissions associated with infrastructure engineering, materials and frequently intense operational carbon emissions associated with infrastructure use, the infrastructure and construction industry face heavy responsibilities in relation to both current and past harm, as well as the role that we play in terms of the crucial role in the fight against climate change. And so with that, and bearing that in mind, the webinar today will look at the international battle to combat climate change and the crucial role that we, and all of us on this webinar today, of the construction and infrastructure sector play in that. We have an amazing panel of leaders from the diverse of roles within the sector from around the globe, from international delivery to construction to financing through to certification and verification. And I'm really, really delighted to be joined by them today and thank them for their time. As Nelson mentioned, we want to be, so please put your questions that you have for the panel onto the chat. The format for this will be similar to other sort of formats of the committee, that each of the panelists will speak for about 5 to 6 minutes. And then we will open it up for a Q&A in terms of we'll actually invite questions and I will facilitate that through in that sort of way. Just it's interesting to see with the poll results, and thank you for doing that. And it's great to see 60% are saying all of above, which is great to see the commitment from everybody on this call of the role of what the infrastructure industry gets to play. So with that in mind, I would like to introduce the panelists. And I'm going to start with Adrian Miller. Adrian is the New Zealand Chief Executive of the Infrastructure Sustainable Council industry, known as ISCA here in New Zealand. And then VJ, so we have Vijay Kulkarni from Midras Teffin Consultants. Then we're going to be followed by Lara Young from the Group Carbon Manager from Costain Limited. Then Bernard Artu from the World Bank, and then going to be joined by Natalie Moore, who is with a GM from Cardno in Australia, but also who is a great supporter of and a vice chair for FIDIC and the Sustainable Development Committee. So that's the order they're going to go. I'm going to probably go silent for the next 30 minutes and just to allow the speakers and panelists come and share their thoughts and observations with us. So thank you, but please, as they go through, please don't hold back and pushing questions through on the chat. So Adrian, I will kindly hand over to you to lead us off.
Thank you, Tracy. Look, I need to start by saying I'm not an engineer, I'm a lawyer by training, and in saying that I've worked with engineers for over 20 years in a range of different capacities in and around the construction and infrastructure sector, so come at this topic from a range of perspectives. Tracy's asked me today to probably take a bit more of a bigger picture approach to this. Infrastructure's been the target of worldwide of much of the post-COVID stimulus spending, and I think it's important with the magnitude of what's in front of us to address climate change that spend is invested advisedly. The debt created means that a similar spend is unlikely for next several generations, so it's important that we get the maximum value from that spend. What I'd like to talk about today, well tonight for me, is not so much about the what, the physical or engineering solutions we deploy to get to net zero, but the why and how we deliver infrastructure, the broader considerations that are at play right now that are driving change. As I see it, there's been a bit of a paradigm shift with infrastructure, and that paradigm shift represents both a risk and an opportunity. While we have all the changes in the physical world creating the need to consider physical resilience, we're also seeing vast changes around the world, and Tracy did touch on this, in terms of the regulatory landscape and also in human expectations or social license. And there's a pace of change that frankly makes your head spin. We need to be mindful of that wider landscape because it too shapes what our response must be, what the opportunity and risk is. Consumers of all hues, whether they're customers, taxpayers, ratepayers, or shareholders, are increasingly not just the passive recipients of goods and services. They are more discerning consumers with expectations not only of the goods and services they buy or the infrastructure that's delivered, but the organisations that produce them. They've started to develop a conscience about what they pay for and invest in. Our staff too have expectations of their employers. They would want their companies to do more than provide a paycheck. They want them to do good and act with purpose. If I had to summarise this, distilling it down, it's thinking about who and what is most impacted and how can negative outcomes be ameliorated and positive impacts increased. We started out appreciating infrastructure because of the asset itself and the amazing engineering and technical competency represented in it. Then we realised that infrastructure was really about what it delivered for the communities it served and meeting their aspirations. Latterly, there's been a revelation that the asset itself can be a vehicle for broader outcomes, and there's a real expectation that it delivers that wider good right across the life cycle of the asset. If social licence and customer demand for change isn't motivating enough, there's also the costs and availability of finance and insurance. Finances and insurers have also become very important. Here in New Zealand, we've adopted a TCFD-like climate-related financial disclosures regime that will be mandatory for publicly listed companies and large insurers, banks, and investment managers. The goal from that is to provide greater transparency and more accurate pricing signals in the market to incentivize low emissions investment and create a level playing field for businesses already considering climate change. Ultimately, it's considered that finance and insurance will be differentially priced based on action on climate issues, providing the right incentives to get the necessary investment on mitigation, adaptation, and ensure resilience in the face of climate change, reducing the risk of stranded assets. Here in New Zealand, we've now got some fairly clear analysis in the form of the National Climate Change Risk Assessment out of our Ministry for the Environment under our Zero Carbon Act. And that legislatively enshrines the responsibility and responses of various players, including our own government. We now, as a nation, are also in possession of advice out of the dedicated climate advisor for government, the New Zealand Climate Change Commission, Te Pauarangi, on what needs to be done to adapt and mitigate the effects of climate change and meet our international obligations. There is much action required here in New Zealand, with our current trajectory seeing us falling short right now on our Paris commitments and a per capita emission rate that is nothing to be proud of. There seems to be an increasing public will to act to address this, and there's lots to do. We need to be thinking about those broader considerations whenever we make decisions about what we build or whether we build. And as I said before, infrastructure can be a vehicle for good, and it can do more. The mistake would be not to think about what stakeholders, shareholders, ratepayers, etc., want of us as players in the infrastructure sector. So I guess that's talking about the opportunity and a bit of a salutary warning. Much has also been written about the responsibility of directors and decision makers. Suffice to say, there are clear conclusions reached that suggest that directors' fiduciary obligations and the role of those responsible for designing buildings and operating assets are quite different than they once were. We're increasingly too seeing climate activism, legal challenges where organisations are perceived not to have gone far enough. So liability risk potentially accrues during transition, where we fail to implement appropriate mitigation and adaptation strategies, knowing the risk. So I think it's a very interesting environment, and one where there is both risk and, as I say, real opportunity for the sector to be an active participant in the pathway to net zero. So that's it from me, Tracy.
Thank you, Adrian. That's fantastic. And I think you've touched a lot there on the social license to operate and that sort of moral and ethic duties, and kind of more beyond that bigger picture of the role that we ultimately get to play. So hopefully there'll be several questions coming in on that. I'm going to hand over now to Vijay. And Vijay, you bring a very different perspective, obviously, from India. And there's a lot of all eyes on India at the moment, and particularly where you're probably in many ways leading the charge around your commitments to Paris and what you're doing around climate ambition. And ultimately last year, set out a lot of ambitious targets of what you're doing, particularly around renewable energies and things. So it'll be fantastic to hear from you, Vijay, and bring a sort of different perspective of what India is doing with regards to this, on top of, I suppose, like everything else, the challenge you're dealing with at the moment in terms of the response to COVID as well.
Thank you, Tracy. At the outset, I must extend to I have an experience of civil engineering, and today I would like to concentrate on basically the Indian scenario as far as the climate change is concerned. With around 1.4 billion population, India accounts for nearly 18% of the humanity, and hence the route of sweeping reduction in carbon need to necessarily pass through India. Although India happens to be the third largest carbon emitting country in quantitative terms, but its per capita emission is not alarming. In fact, the carbon is less than 5%. So that even by 2030, the per capita emission from India will be less than the world average. In spite of this, the Indian government voluntarily declared that the country will reduce its carbon emission by 30 to 35% of its 2005 level by 2030, mainly with the use of renewable energy. During the past 6 years, impressive additions have been made to the installed RE capacity from almost 40 gigawatts to 93 gigawatts at an investment of around $62 billion. Recently, the government of India announced an ambitious and bold target of increasing the country's installed RE capacity to 450 gigawatts, a gigantic task indeed. But the question is why one should depend on the government's effort alone. Why can't the construction industry fraternities supplement the government effort? Take, for example, the case of rooftop solar or wind, in which the achievement is much lower than the expected target in India. Here is a role for consultant. We should aggressively start convincing all stakeholders to use the rooftop solar wind for a variety of purposes like residential buildings, commercial buildings, schools, colleges, malls, railway stations, bus stop, bus depot, flyovers, bridges, and city roads, etc., so that RE can be used to partially compensate the day-to-day operational energy needs requirement. This is a win-win situation for all stakeholders, as the cost of solar energy in India has decreased by 1/3 and the wind energy by 1/2 from their peak. Consultant can also help in a big way in reducing the embodied carbon, especially when India is in the midst of infrastructure growth. Consultants need to calculate embodied carbon of different alternative designs, considering the entire 5 stages of the life cycle. Besides, of course, the standard requirement of safety, serviceability, durability, etc., and then choose the alternative having the lowest embodied carbon. However, what is prevalent in India and maybe in some other country is the adoption of conventional approach to ensure sustainability, which includes steps such as increasing the recycled content, improving long-term durability, certification through eco-rating system, etc., etc. All these are certainly essential. However, in my opinion, the time has arrived to transcend beyond these boundaries. In addition to following the conventional pillars of sustainability, we also need to ensure sweeping reduction in both energy use and carbon emissions. It is reported that this will prove to be a cost-effective approach to avoid climate breakdown, as our buildings and construction account for nearly 38% of the carbon emission globally. Now, finally, there is an urgent need to evolve a roadmap to achieve sweeping reduction of carbon emission for buildings and construction in India by involving all stakeholders. And I think here FIDIC can help, because it needs to be a completely Indian initiative. That is what I feel. Thank you very much for patient listening.
Thank you, Vijay. And look, I do think we will probably touch on that in our panel discussion. I think we have a lot to certainly learn from India. You're certainly walking the talk there, and I imagine we'll probably talk about how others can what we can take away and where some of the sharings and things like that across from many of us around the globe. Excuse me, I'm going to hand over now to Laura Young. So Laura brings a different perspective now, probably from the constructors and build perspective. So Laura's in the UK, joins from the UK, and Laura's role there is the group carbon manager from Costain, and brings probably a very different perspective to many of the speakers you've heard to date. So Laura, I'll just hand over to you.
Brilliant. Thank you ever so much, Tracy. And hi, everyone. So just to put it into perspective, so from Costain's organisational perspective, we get involved at every life cycle stage of a project. So from design, advisory, but also all the way through to delivery and asset optimisation. So the framework or the examples that I'm going to go through is more to illustrate how we've gone about this and very much sort of bring to life some of the key points that Vijay and Adrian referred to and mentioned, really framing the challenge of what infrastructure has a part to play in actually making net zero reality. So how are we going about that? So from Costain's perspective, and I think this is valid, be it at a country level, as Vijay just mentioned, an organisational level, or even at a project level, the principle around net zero, understanding net zero infrastructure remains always the same, whilst the solution might not be. And there is not one silver bullet to net zero. The premise of how we go about it and actually remaining on that focus and ensuring that ongoing delivery of it is key to ensure that we're constantly driving down emissions. So from our perspective, how do we actually get from the we need to do this to what do we actually need to do as an organisation or as an industry? It really is the clarity around actually net zero and the whole climate change, wider than just net zero, but the whole climate change agenda can be made into a dark art, and it's extremely complex. And whilst we appreciate the fact it's challenging, that doesn't mean it's unfeasible to take action now. So there is a huge amount of innovation going on in this space. And whilst there is still some things that need to continue to innovate for tomorrow, there are some really tangible things that we can take forward and take action on today around efficiency, for example, in that advisory and consultancy phases, around really pinpointing and understanding and unpicking and bringing to light for clients, for the supply chain, for projects, where the biggest carbon and cost opportunity and reductions are. So a big one of the greatest challenges around net zero from my perspective, which unlocks this, is actually having clarity of where are the biggest bangs for your buck in terms of effort and carbon reduction and opportunity. And then once you have the clarity, so being able to map out that whole life cycle footprint to understand actually where is the greatest opportunity to reduce emissions at that point in the life cycle of a project or of infrastructure that you're involved with. Once you've got that map and you know where your greatest opportunities are, it's really homing in on those to then really take it to town in terms of what you can do, what's feasible to roll out, and then following through on that. So ensuring that there are the mechanisms, and Vijay mentioned it as well, of not just setting this up right, but then the following through to actually making this happen and delivering it. So for me, the educational piece of understanding where we need to target most and how infrastructure has a prominent and leading role in ensuring this and unpicking what net zero means, but also on making that happen. So clarity around that and really focusing and homing in on those greatest emission hotspots. So not trying to do everything in one go, but rationalizing, prioritizing. That doesn't mean you won't follow through on other elements later, but really focusing on the key greatest emission sources in the first instance to get that rolling and then move on. And this is in conjunction with, driving other climate change related initiatives around natural capital and biodiversity, which is very much interlinked in that same principle. And that principle is very much transposable across the whole approach for net zero. So whilst the solution isn't unique, the approach in which and how to go about this certainly is. So yeah, hopefully that's helped bring to life and unpick how Costain have gone about understanding that. So through our climate change action plan is just an example of how we've broken this down to make it into bite-sized pieces to understand what's the first step that brings us on to the second, etc., to get to net zero. So thank you so much, and I'll hand back to you, Tracy.
Thank you, Laura. And I think you've certainly given a lot of people a lot to think about, and hopefully some questions will come in there, and particularly in the end, that raise of that climate change initiatives and that linkage to biodiversity and natural capital, you know, and hopefully we'll maybe talk about that a little bit more, and also that innovation. I think we've heard innovation mentioned several times to date, really, and I imagine a lot of people will probably start thinking, well, what does that look like? What does innovation truly look like for the industry, and what do we need to do a little bit more of? So thank you for that. Bernard, thank you joining us in Beijing from the World Bank. You know, I know the World Bank group in particular has been very instrumental in helping countries around the world address climate change, including a lot of the climate financing and things that you do. So the floor is yours, Bernard, to share your perspective, particularly in that financing world.
Thank you very much for this opportunity to speak. And it's great to be among engineers. I often sit in rooms where there are a lot of economists, and one thing that strikes me is how different the communication is between engineers and the rest. And I would like to come at this from a financing perspective, and this is very important. Anyone who has been paying attention to the G7 summit will have had this pledge to build back better for the world, with very lofty aspirations. What you did not hear was how this grand plan for infrastructure will be financed. There's an estimate of somewhere between $40 to $45 trillion worth of infrastructure gap that needs to be filled. And the question really is, where will this financing come from? It will come from the private sector, institutional investors, and other investors who hold private financing, but also from institutions like the World Bank, international finance institutions, alongside public institutions. And for the World Bank and for the financing sector, there's been a huge paradigm shift in the last couple of years. And for the World Bank, this came around 2008, when a group of Scandinavian investors approached the World Bank to request for a very special type of financing instrument, which has now been called the green bonds. And the difference between the green bonds and other forms of bonds that are issued is that these institutional investors were under pressure from their shareholders to draw a link between the investments and the actual impact. In other words, they wanted to see behind the financing and also look at what is financed. This was a very important moment for the World Bank because it revealed that there was a lot, that the pressure from the public towards a world that is addresses climate change was real. And this was beginning to hurt the institutional investors as well. Since then, that sector of green bonds has grown as a special financing, asset financing class to over $375 billion this year. And I think in accumulated assets, almost $3 trillion, and it's just going to grow with time. So the shift for the World Bank has been, how do we then, as an organization, prepare for this change in the financial services sector? And two major reforms will have an impact on the infrastructure sector. One is the procurement reform, in which a new procurement framework has been prepared that explicitly mandates recipient countries or recipients of financing from the World Bank to incorporate in their procurement of assets how they're going to address and innovate in terms of climate change. The second was what we refer to as the environment and social framework. And the big paradigm shift is, for 40 years before 2018, the World Bank's approach to addressing social and environment safeguards was do no harm. So all our instruments and all our procedures were geared towards making sure any investment does no harm. Does no harm to the environment and the recipients. the main shift now is to do good. And so the requirement for governments and anyone involved in the supply chain is to demonstrate not only that they're doing no harm, but actually how they're going to do good. So through this new environment and social safeguards framework, 10 standards have been incorporated, which include things such as resource efficiency, biodiversity, and embedded within that is what is referred to as a environment and social commitment plan. In other words, it's not enough to just receive financing from the World Bank, but you must also demonstrate how in the delivery of the project, you will fulfill those obligations. And what is happening in the World Bank has been cascading into all other institutions. For example, through the Equator Principles or the Principles for Responsible Investment, which many institutional investors have subscribed to. Now, what does this mean for the engineering fraternity? It means that wherever you live, whether you live in India or China or Africa, there is a wave of a paradigm shift which is going to come at you. And the investments from the huge infrastructure plan that has been laid out by the G7, and also by bilateral investments such as the Belt and Road Initiative, will increasingly focus on how to achieve net zero. What this means for individual members of the supply chain is not to window dress how you address climate change and achievement of net zero, your contribution, but to take a very deep, incisive look at your organizations, whether consultancy, contractor, academia, on 3 areas. One is what sort of talent you have within your organization. And the talent refers not only to the engineering skills, but their application in relation to addressing climate change impacts, and also the broader skills of how you engage with other stakeholders. This is number one. The second is the product offering. What exactly do you offer as an organization, whatever organization you are? And to think carefully about whether that current offering will be relevant in the next 15, short, medium, and long term, because this wave of responsible financing that focuses on net zero is not going away. It's just going to increase. The third and probably the most important, and I touched on this from the introduction, is how do we as engineers communicate effectively what it is that we do with regard to actually moving the needle on attainment of net zero? Because at many of the tables where decisions are made, there are hardly any engineers. They're all economists, financiers, philosophers, and politicians. Why are there no engineers sitting at these tables? And any messages that come from different advocates for climate change very rarely feature the role of engineers. And yet engineers are the ones who will deliver these very large aspirations. So I'll stop here, but the big message that I hope you can take from my comments is that there is a real shift in thinking from the financing sector, whether it's private, public, or the large IFIs. And now is the time for us to position ourselves genuinely, not as placards or buzzwords, but genuinely positioning ourselves to take on this challenge. Thank you.
Thank you, Bernard. Fantastic. And I love that quote, build back better for the world. I think New Zealand and our New Zealand Prime Minister uses that quite a lot, build back better. It's kind of how New Zealand is kind of driving ourselves forward from post-pandemic, really. So it's something that I think we all need to kind of think about, and particularly the role that financing plays in that. But ultimately, I think you touched on again, and we'll probably talk about this a little bit as panel, that whole collaboration as a whole. You touched on the whole supply chain and role that we all play, you know. So I think that's something that again, you know, how do we collectively as that supply chain together on that. So financing side, which I'll take a look at in a minute. So last not but least is Natalie Murr, who's our vice chair of FIDIC from the Sustainable Development Committee, and also the GM of Environment and Water with Cardner here in Australia. And Natalie, thank you for stepping in last minute. Natalie was meant to be my co-host actually, but unfortunately Robert Spencer, who's also one of our vice chairs, he's currently on holiday, and unfortunately he must be enjoying himself because his Wi-Fi just didn't hold up for him to join us this evening. So we do miss Robert, but thank you, Natalie. And Natalie's going to kindly just talk a little bit around the role that we are doing in terms of the Sustainable Development Committee and some of the things that we have been looking at and looking forward ahead, but also I suppose the role that engineering in that world plays as a whole, and take that designer perspective in that. So Natalie, thank you. I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Tracy, and pleasure to be here tonight. Look, what an awesome array of speakers that we've just heard from, some real experts across the globe. So I think as a Sustainable Development Committee, we've been really pleased to have such a fascinating group of people together tonight, and really keen to launch into the discussion. So as Tracy said, I thought what I'd do is just give a bit of an outline of some of the things that the Sustainable Development Committee have been working on. So we've been together since I think about August last year, and Tracy, Robert and myself as chair and vice chairs, I guess, have been driving the group in a few different directions. And I guess, so I'll touch on those, and then I'll talk a little bit about how, the engineering community perhaps contributes to this discussion. So one of our first key areas of focus is actually COP26. And, we talked about that, Nelson talked about that at the outset. Of course, the UN Climate Change Conference scheduled for Glasgow in November of this year. And I guess what we really want to try and do is make sure that the engineering industry does have that seat at the table, as Bernard was sort of saying, making sure that the voice of the engineering industry is represented. So we have been busy working on a couple of collaborative proposals, which were for some some events as part of COP. Unfortunately, they don't seem to have been successful, but we're obviously continuing to chase up on how we might be able to contribute to that. So those two proposals were with the World Wildlife Federation, and also one with the UK Institute of Civil Engineers. So continuing to pursue that. FIDIC also has observer status at COP26. So I guess we're also just trying to work out how we can contribute to that and make the best use of that and bring some of that information back to our members. One of the other key things that we've been looking at is a climate change charter. So we've got, I guess, a bit of a draft charter which we might be looking to provide member associations and consulting staff some expectations and guidelines about how they might meaningfully contribute to the whole climate change agenda. So we have, I guess, put together a draft and working with the board to try and look at where we might take it. So, it's all about setting goals and purpose and how some of the different groups from professional engineering level through to companies, how they might impact their projects, and also some guidance for member associations, and also some stuff at the FIDIC level. So trying to, I guess, look at some commitments that might happen at each of these levels. And the idea is that, I guess, companies may be able to sign up to the charter or the like to demonstrate their commitment towards net zero. So, again, it's a bit of a work in progress, but there's been a lot of effort going into putting together that guidance document. So watch this space, I guess, and there'll be some more information on that side of things. The next, I guess one of the other things that we've been working on is the State of the World report. So Nelson talked about these at the outset as well. So one of our task groups is specifically focusing on that State of the World series. So 2 reports have been released so far. The first one, which was called Time to Invest, and that really talked about the $7 trillion per year challenge to provide infrastructure, not only just to meet the needs of society, but to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, and also that investment required to recover from COVID. The second State of the World report, which was called The Value of Water, has also been released, and we're currently working on the third report, which will be released in July, called Tackling the Global Water Crisis. The next couple on the agenda are about sustainable cities, technology, and net zero. So again, more interesting things in the series of State of the World reports, and talking about some of the real key issues facing our industry. And then finally, I guess just another thing to touch on in terms of things that we've been working on, I guess as a result of the collaboration with the World Wildlife Federation about COP26, they've given us some great insights into some nature-based and green infrastructure solutions, which I'm sure we can all learn from. So I guess just continuing our discussions with them and looking at maybe some opportunities to collaborate on some specific projects there. So again, that's still in the early days. Committee's only been going for just under 12 months now. So I guess a few of these things are still got a little way to run, but some really exciting discussions that we've been having with WWF. And I think I'm certainly really excited as to where we might be able to take that. So then I guess that leads us to the question, around where and how does the engineering community contribute? And, Bernard actually touched on this before too, policy is obviously something that's really important. We've seen some really strong commitments from governments around the world. And whilst you have the policy making, setting direction, talking about where we should go and putting that flag on the hill, at the end of the day, it'll be the engineering and scientific community that'll make it happen. So, we really as an industry need to embrace net zero in our language, in our approach to solving problems. Some of the solutions might be already at our fingertips, but others will require us to really think differently and reimagine infrastructure solutions. Something I think that's been talked about a little bit at the State of the World webinars is also that, the opportunity to influence and the opportunity to really decarbonise solutions needs to come pretty early in the project life cycle. You can certainly look at ways to reduce carbon during the construction of a road or a building or a piece of infrastructure. But what if there was an entirely different solution, which is actually a carbon sink or, carbon positive? It's potentially the difference between offsetting the impact and not actually making that impact in the first place. So, I think as Lara also talked about, I think we need to look at taking that carbon out at every step along the journey. But certainly the biggest gains, I think, will be rethinking the infrastructure solution itself back in the solution development and project development phases. Many of the engineers, I'm sure, will have seen the graphs that talk about the opportunity to influence cost is much greater earlier in the project lifecycle. And I think it's exactly the same for sustainability. It's where you can think about the problem holistically and look for the most sustainable solution. As Adrian said, it's about what we do and whether we actually build something. So, I think that's really crucial that we get involved nice and early in that process. So Bill also commented, I think, at the outset that, engineers certainly can and should bring us cost effectively to net zero. So we definitely have the skill set. We have the innovative minds. We just really need that opportunity to contribute. So really looking forward to the discussion amongst the panelists as to how we can contribute and drive the world towards net zero. Back to you, Tracy.
Thank you, Natalie. And I think we're quite excited as the entire committee in relation to the pledge and being able to kind of get that out to our members and things like that. But I think you have touched again on an important point around what is the role that this community, or both the infrastructure and construction community really does play to drive to a net zero sort of world. And ultimately, that's probably what we'll get into talking now. And there's a lot of questions.
Tracy?
Sorry, Nelson.
Tracy?
Oh, Bill. Yes, sorry Bill.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I tend to do this on occasion, but Natalie hit on a very hot button that I'd just like to spend a couple of seconds elaborating on. One of the first presidents that I served with on the board was Pablo Bueno, and he had I think a great phrase that came to mind when Natalie was chatting about getting the engineers involved early. And I believe he hit the nail right on the head in saying that very often the best engineering, the most valuable engineering is done at that conceptual planning phase. And that's sort of a nice elevator speech for all of us to sort of keep in mind, because it is spot on. We can, as Natalie said, we can influence a lot during all phases of a project, but right at the beginning is when we really have a chance to get the thing moving in the right direction. So sorry, Tracy, to jump in, but I had to elaborate on that point. Thank you, Natalie.
No, thank you, Bill, for jumping in, and please do. And anyone else who needs to jump, I think this is part of the conversation of really picking up on one of the things. And like I said, there's so many questions coming in, and thank you for everyone. I think we have about 1,200 people signed up for today in terms of the webinar, and certainly there's a flurry of comments and observations and questions coming through. So apologies if I do not get to all of them. I've certainly tried to flick through all of them, and we certainly will look through them afterwards just to make sure on that. But there's a couple of, I will just probably start on one. And there's several questions probably looking to the panel to maybe give a little bit more examples, based on their sort of experiences and things like that. Some linked a little bit to cost and some not. But one of the questions here, can the panel just recall any global examples of an infrastructure project or program aimed at net zero, which was successfully able to lower their overall cost of capital? So I think this comes into this cost perspective, and maybe thinking things are very expensive to a certain point. I don't know if anyone wants to take that question, or whether, Laura, do you want to have a stab at that, and maybe Bernard and the views there?
Yeah, no worries. So in terms of examples, there's multiple examples of actually mapping out and achieving and understanding actually what is the whole life cycle cost, and mirroring the whole life cycle carbon footprint associated to that. And there is quite a misconception that reducing carbon or carbon emissions is at a cost, when actually fundamentally, whilst there's always going to be the exception potentially, and there might be a requirement for capital investment at the beginning, but the whole life cost is balanced out. So I've got several examples. So if we take Gatwick Station project, which we Costain delivered designed for Network Rail, so the asset owner across for UK Rail, and that's just an example of the train station, a complete upgrade of the concourses, etc. Actually taking more time at the beginning, and very much, can't recall who said it, but actually the huge opportunity actually in a design space of, it might take a little bit more time to look at in more detail, but mapping out what we did, understanding actually where were the hotspots, very simply. And whilst the data is not always going to be perfect, there is a sufficient amount of data in our industry to understand what the big hotspots are. We can continue to refine the data to get that picture more clearly, but actually we knew where those greatest emission spares were, focusing on those and really working with not just the supply chain, but also the client, because everyone has a part to play in making this happen, be that updating specifications, alternative materials and innovative technologies, to really incorporating that into the design, which as a result actually required, whilst as a higher capital investment, a long-term operational efficiency for the station as a whole. And just an example, Costain have what we call a resource efficiency matrix, which is a framework that ensures to ask the right questions that we apply across all of our contracts, regardless of nature, scale, size or industry. And over the years, that has achieved, over the last 3 years since its launch, we've achieved about £50 million reduction for both capital and costs for ourselves, the clients and the supply chain, and just under 2 million tonnes of carbon emissions associated to those. So they very much go hand in hand. It's just ensuring that we are aligning and looking at apples and apples, if you like. So understanding that whole life cost and our whole life carbon on the same page. And then you can identify where your greatest opportunities are. So thank you.
Fantastic, Laura. Thank you. Does anyone else want to comment on that, or shall I go to another?
If I may just comment.
Oh,
sorry.
Yeah, Bernard, go ahead.
If I may just comment very briefly, I think the question is important, and the issues around life cycle costing at a project level are important. But we need to look at this much more broadly than the infrastructure, piece of infrastructure. If you take the example, let me give you one example from India. The World Bank was financing the dedicated freight corridor project, which is the largest freight-only railway line built to date. It's over 1,600 kilometers in the northern part of India, partially financed by the World Bank and JICA. And if you look at it as a point-to-point railway project, actually the impact on the environment is significant, but not as big as if you look at it from a more holistic perspective, including not just the infrastructure, but the opportunities to reshape industrial policy and the way that logistics chains work, the way that society along the railway line is organized. That has a much more bigger impact, and which gets the attention not only of engineering fraternity and folks who finance infrastructure, but of society much more broadly.
And Adrian, you'll probably pick up on that then, society much more broadly.
Yes, so what I was just going to say, I've just popped into the chat. We've had some economic analysis work done around the return on investment from considering sustainability matters. By that, I don't just mean the net zero, but quadruple bottom line outputs. And using our rating scheme, we've seen quantified returns of between $1.60 and $2.40 for every dollar spent undertaking sustainable initiatives. So we've actually had that quantified by economists. So I've just included in the chat the link to the report on that in case that's of interest.
Brilliant, thank you. Vijay, I might put a question to you, and this may be a little bit is that, again, going back to India, very much walking the talk and your commitment of cutting, your emission intensity by 35% of the 2005 levels by 2030 and things like that. I suppose that the question is, well, what do you feel is setting you apart at the moment, and how do others, how do we learn from what you are doing there? Vijay, I think you're on mute. Sorry, still.
Can you just repeat the question?
Just more of Vijay, how do we learn from India? You are walking the talk. How does the rest of everyone on this call and things like that? How do India seems to be leading the way? What would be the kind of key takeaways that that the rest of the world could take from what India is doing?
I think our journey from basically there is one question on coal also, that major power source is today coal only. More than 50% is coming from coal. But what's happening is the renewable energy is freely available as a resource in India, and that is what the government is trying to tap on a big scale. So what the engineers need to do is to help in using. I give the example of rooftop solar. The gap between actually target and the actual achievement is lower because there is a resistance to use this, and there is lack of awareness, especially when the cost has come down. So it is actually, we have to create awareness amongst the users as well as all spheres of construction, that this is what you should do. Okay. And as far as there is one more question on to me on giving example of Madhya Pradesh, which is a small state in India. Yes, they have achieved, but on an average, the performance in the rooftop solar has to improve so that we are able to reduce our operational energy requirement.
Thank you, Vijay. That's really, really important, and some good points that put there. A couple of questions that have come in, and I might put this to, maybe Natalie, I'll address this to you. This is around, because I know a little bit as talk about, we're probably talking a lot, particularly in New Zealand and Australia at the moment, around constraints around skills. I think all of us are experiencing issues around capacity and capability and within the industry and things like that. And one of the questions here is really just around skills and the gaps, just that shortage of skills and the role that will ultimately play, and has kind of addressed it to the panel in general around, what is the role, in relation to that skill and that capacity shortage to be able to kind of support what we need to do to drive to net zero as an industry. I don't know, maybe Natalie, if you want to comment first around that skill gap in the construction industry.
Sure. So look, I think one of the good things about sustainability and driving net zero is that, and the engineering industry, I guess in general, is it's not just about engineers. So there's lots of different skill sets that are required. And I think in particular, when you start to talk about driving solutions towards net zero, we need to actually embrace that diversity even further. So, whilst I guess we're talking about the engineering industry here and the role that engineers can play in the net zero infrastructure, we also can't overlook the variety of skills that we need to get involved. So the ecologists, the biologists, the community consultation people, lawyers, and all sorts of different skill sets. And so I guess the skill shortage is real, and yeah, as you say, Tracy, I think many of us are seeing challenges in trying to attract and retain and get the right sort of people in the room. But I think perhaps if we think a little bit broader and make sure that we're actually getting the views of all the diversity of people that can contribute to driving some of these solutions, that actually almost overcomes it to a certain extent. You get the same number of people in the room to drive the solution, but you get a greater diversity of thought, and through that, obviously, we can then hopefully drive different solutions and really that, thinking differently, reimagining infrastructure, all of those sorts of things.
Fantastic. Laura, are you experiencing the same at the moment in Europe and particularly in the UK?
Yeah, I'd say there's a huge amount. I think it's twofold. So there is a great part of actually there are some new skills, and I think of recognizing what they're going to be to have the resilience, to have that supply as this progresses and as we continue. So there is a huge amount around widening the scope, but I 100% agree with Natalie. Actually, it's not just the engineering community, it's every community and every type of job role and discipline. Actually, it's translating what does net zero and the wider climate change agenda mean for them in their roles. So actually, they don't need to be a carbon expert necessarily, but it's understanding actually, if you are a quantity surveyor, if you are a planner, if you're someone in community relations, what does that mean in their day-to-day? So there's a huge piece around educating everyone around what does net zero mean for them and how do they play their part. But I also think a big part of net zero and that this achieving, especially from the infrastructure side of things, is this isn't a complete knee-jerk reaction. There is a huge amount of what we already do in some areas that actually is working towards net zero, but rather than that being the innovation piece and the thing that we do is sort of the smaller project, and it's great to do, but actually that needs to become the mainstream. So a lot of this is also making some of the areas and some of the things that we already do and we do really, really well, just far greater and accelerating those pieces. So a lot of this is also transposing and building on already some of the great things that we're doing. So it is a key balance between new skills, but also ensuring that we make more widespread what we currently do really well and need to continue to do. So from my perspective.
Brilliant. Thank you, Laura. I love a comment here from Rick. I have to give a shout out to Rick Walters here because he said, why did lawyers and economists get to run the world? And how can engineers take a more permanent or prominent role in decision making? Do engineers need to get more active in politics? Yes, to a certain point, but good points being made here. And I think there's lots of comments. Another one, why engineers not sitting on the table for discussion on climate change? Again, I think Bernard, you picked that point around. We ultimately need to be around the table and very much an active part in that sort of thing, and not sitting back. And Bill made the point of conceptual planning phase and right up the front. So we actually do need to be in the early stages and front stages of all of this sort of stuff and things like that. Bernard, there is a lot of questions on the finance, and this is a question specifically for you here, which was picked up around. Do you think the rate at which the financing world, both private, I know I've lost it in this question, both private and public, wait now, I need to find it now. People are typing too quickly here that I've lost my question. But I think it was gone here. Do you think the rate at which the financing world, both public and private, is gearing up to deal with the change you foresee is sufficient to successfully support the current momentum that the infrastructure sector internationally needs? And if not, how would you address it? So Bernard, I don't know if you can, are you able to take that question?
That's a very complex question that is loaded, and it would be difficult to answer it in one sentence. But look, the point that I made was there is a genuine paradigm shift. And this comes from the decision makers, as you saw from the G7 summit. But critically, what you did not see is the paradigm shift in the financial services sector. because not only is climate change a danger to our future and the future of our children, but it's also an opportunity for institutional investors who are coming under a lot of pressure from their shareholders. And my sense is that many of them do not necessarily come into this green bonds and green financing or net zero world purely from altruistic motives, but there is also the commercial driver. And over the last 1 year, many of them have been at home, working from home. And it's quite easy to sit and look at your children, your grandchildren, and think, what can I do to make their future better than what it would otherwise be? And so many of them, even among the CEOs and the people I've been meeting with, are genuinely concerned at a personal level, but also at a sector level. And so that's what I believe is going to be the big change this time around.
Fantastic. Thanks, Bernard. There's a question, a lot of it's come about innovation, but there's a couple of things I've kind of touched on in terms of digital technology. And I suppose, I open this up for any of the panelists to take up, but what is the role of digital technology in achieving net zero? And then how can we leverage more of Internet of Things, more technologies to kind of bring the efficiencies and things like that in? I don't know if anyone wants to particularly take that question.
I'm quite happy.
Laura, you take that.
Yeah, so from my perspective, just quickly, I think there is a key part where there are some digital solutions that provide direct solutions that are really transposed into engineering or infrastructure. But most of the time, I'd say the digital solution enables to provide the information to understand actually where the hotspot is. It's then using that output to actually drive change. So you can have the best carbon calculator in the world or any digital solution, I'm just generically here, but it's using the outputs of what that data is telling you to actually drive genuine change and to take action that will actually get you to net zero. So for me, the digital solutions piece is key and it is pivotal to achieving net zero, but it's an enabler to get there. It's not the final solution.
I was just going to add, Tracy, that I think it's also, you mentioned, or someone mentioned about the diversity of contributions. I think it was either Lara or Natalie. You can also use the data to do much more intensive sort of analysis around what it is that the users and consumers of the infrastructure want or need, patterns of movement. So data and AI will inform what we design and build, and also the use patterns, so we better understand that. I think you sort of said the same thing, Lara, but it's an enabler.
Brilliant. Thanks both. Another, I love this. E is common in engineering, economists, and environmentalists. Let's use this commonality to working on net zero solutions together. That's a kind of that's a great comment. That's another VJ who's actually put that in a comment box. Look, another question that's kind of come in here and it's kind of picked up more broader. And I think Adrian had touched, actually, I think it touched on what you spoke to in the society issues, similar to Bernard, and even many of you touched on. But it says that climate change is not just an environmental issue; it is fundamentally a human issue. And it will deeply impact the well-being and livelihoods of individuals and communities across the globe. And we're seeing that playing out. There's a lot of comments put in there around, the pandemic and COVID, and what is that doing to kind of accelerate some of the issues or not around climate change. So as with all these things, those impacts will not be shared equally. And some communities in certain locations will feel the impacts of climate change more acutely. Indeed, climate change may exacerbate existing poverty and inequality. What we can do as technical, so the question is, what can we do as technical specialists to ensure that the distribution of climate impacts, both benefits and costs, is fair and appropriate? And how do we make sure that no one is left behind? So that's quite a broad question to there. I don't know if Adrian, you're on screen, whether you want to maybe start on that first and probably just break it down into little parts. But I think it just touches on that whole piece that we've been describing around that it's not just an environmental issue. It really is, it's human issues, it's society issues, they're kind of global issues as a bigger beast that fundamentally, that we're kind of talking about here.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think it is fundamentally a human issue. It's existential, really, isn't it? Look, if all the economic analysis in the world's going to be utterly useless to us if we don't have a world to live in, or it's so, our systems and infrastructure fails in the face of its inability to adapt to what the new climate future might be, and that impacts us all. But I think your point too, Tracy, about equitable transitions. So it's really important as we consider ways of adapting that we actually bring everybody on that journey together, and everybody will start from a different position. It's a bit like the parallel conversation in the diversity and inclusion space around, equity and removing systemic barriers. The same sort of considerations apply, I think.
Vijay, do you want to touch on that as well? Could you pass on a comment on that?
Hello, Tracy. I think whatever we do in the infrastructure development has to benefit to the broader sections of the society. As you said, we can't leave any section of the society behind, and because there are occasions when the climate change affect adversely the most poor people. So we have to ensure when we are doing infrastructure that we take everybody around, and we take them on the board and see that the benefits are passed on to all sections of the society.
Thank you. I'm just looking at another, and actually, Laura, you touched on the biodiversity piece, and there is a kind of a question that, again, maybe extends that other question, but it probably talks about delivering major infrastructure increases, quality of life for people, but progress for us can mean harm to natural habitats and biodiversity as a whole. How can we ensure that infrastructure projects and urban realm enhance rather than degrade the environment? I don't know if you want to, Laura, touch on that.
Yeah, definitely. I think a few people have mentioned it. There are massive synergies between, the economic balance and that circular economy piece, in addition to natural capital and biodiversity and net zero. So these can't afford to and can't progress in silos. Actually, they're all very intertwined, and a lot of the things we're achieving and the initiatives rolled out and some things that we need to do around net zero will have effects on biodiversity and natural capital in addition to social value as well. So there isn't one single answer. What is necessary to ensure that we do take it forward is having an understanding of all of the impacts of those different, whether it's with the impact on biodiversity, on net zero, on social value, to understand, okay, what is the overall impacts of this solution, to then be able to have that balance and understand what is the most appropriate initiative or project to take forward. So for me, it's key to ensure that we actually do have all of the information on one page so that we're able to assess and have informed decisions, understanding the wider impacts, not just on that project. I think it was Bernard that mentioned not just the project implications, but those wider implications. But the key to that, and what's pivotal, that is whilst data can be information overload, it's using data or using those digital insights to have an informed decision to map that out without overloading it, because otherwise you can get information overload. But yeah, it's a fine balance.
It is a fine balance. I'm conscious about time, and there's. Sorry, Natalie. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to add to that. I think one of the comments was sort of around, it's not just about carbon. Obviously, net zero is about carbon, but I think we've got to be mindful that net zero is a campaign to obviously and a drive to help make us change. But the ultimate goal is actually achieving the SDGs, which is the philosophy of leaving no one behind. So, there's plenty of stuff in there around biodiversity, life above land, life below water, all those sorts of things. So I think net zero is a mechanism to drive us on the carbon front. But yeah, I do think we've got to be really careful to make sure that we don't forget about all the other aspects, because the end game is achieving the SDGs and truly leaving no one behind.
Fantastic. And that's really, really great points on that. conscious there's a lot of questions and obviously in time. So, you know, and I know Adrian, others and some of the panelists and have put up like access to YouTube sites, you know, other information, things like that. So maybe afterwards people will have kind of access to kind of have a look about it, what's been downloaded on that. Just probably maybe I'll go to each of you as we kind of wrap up of maybe final comments. You know, we have a lot of people. There was 1,400 people registered, you know, the entire broad infrastructure and construction sector, and others are kind of here. You know, we've talked about building back better. We've talked about the reality of these as society, human issues. What's the one point, one message you'd like to give to our community of what we ultimately need to do? I might start with, well, I start Adrian. I'll go the way we went through the speakers. Adrian.
Sorry, I'll just unmute myself there. Sorry. I think that my sort of parting comment is the time for sustainable big picture thinking's now. And all of our post-COVID recovery programs need to be structured to address the wider impacts than just the economic recovery. And I think the building back has to be building back from the sort of aspirational future that Natalie was just talking about, the idea that, you know, we're aiming for UN SDGs. Incrementalism won't get us there. We have to aim for something much different and be aspirational about it.
Fantastic, thank you. VJ, what's your call of arms, VJ?
Yeah,
what would you like?
Yeah, I like to say is about what Bernard talked about, the green procurement policy. I think that is very much essential today, which is not available. If the World Bank has made any standard, you know, on this kind of thing, because in India the public procurement is very big, actually speaking. So, but there is no green procurement policy as such. So maybe World Bank can help if they have a model green procurement policy.
Fantastic, thank you, VJ. Laura.
Yeah, mine would be is taking ownership of our roles and responsibilities. So 100%, has finance got a part to play? Yes. Has procurement got a part to play? Yes. But everyone within your roles, even within the whole breadth of what we do in engineering, it's actually holding ourselves to account. And actually there is a lot of innovation that needs to happen. There's some really tangible things that a number of us have mentioned that we can do now, and we don't need to wait to be asked to do them. So I think it's actually playing our part, for me, is the key one, and doing it now.
Fantastic. Bernard?
Yeah, so my sense, and I think the point which I hope I made very clearly here, is that he who pays the piper calls the tune, right? Is the English idiom. The financial services sector is changing, and these commitments to work towards net zero will come at us. And the call to action is, for me, is 3 words. One is to adapt. We must be willing to adapt, either at a personal level, or at the level of firm or industry. One is to adapt. Second is to innovate. And innovation is not necessarily coming up with new things, but using what we have differently and better. And the third call to action is inspire. If you can inspire a future generation of engineers to take the mantle, to sit at the front of the table and take the ownership for transforming the world at an individual level, at a level of the institutions or fraternities such as this, would have done a lot. So adapt, innovate, inspire is my call to action.
Brilliant. Thank you, Bernard. And Natalie?
Yeah, so I guess with a bit of an industry perspective, you know, I think if you reflect that, you know, engineers are really great at solving problems. I think, as Bill said at the outset, we really need to remind the world of the great things that engineers do. You know, as an industry, we've got this. We can do it. We just need to embrace the change, try to get a seat at the table with decision makers, make sure we influence those projects early. We can absolutely drive some change and move the needle on sustainability and help us, you know, build a better world.
Thank you, everyone. And thank you so much for joining us. I think I'm going to hand over to Nelson now, or do we have one more poll, or we have final poll question? And look, we talked about this, and I think it's probably quite a simple yes, no, but climate change is not just an environmental issue, it is a human issue, and it will deeply impact the well-being and livelihood of individuals and beauty worldwide. Does the infrastructure industry put importance on its social license to operate? And we kind of talked about, I think Bernard touched around, healthy organizations. Actually, myself and Adrian today were at an event here in New Zealand in Auckland, which touched deeply on this around our own social license to operate and the role that we played. And we touched around our moral and ethic duties and things like that. And I think Bill touched on it at the start as well. So if you'd like to now have a poll on that, well, I think quite unanimously, 83%. I think for the 17% who don't feel that, maybe might want to think about that, and particularly when we put out our pledge, hopefully that we can all kind of commit and sign up to kind of take that forward. So Nelson, I will hand over to you and Bill to wrap us up. But thank you, and again, thank you to Natalie, to Bernard, to Vijay, Laura, and Adrian. A great conversation. We were only warming up, I think, and thank to everyone who's joined the call, because there's some amazing questions and just observations and comments really put in there. So thank you for everyone for joining us tonight, and hopefully look forward to the committee of us kind of keeping in touch and seeing you at upcoming webinars to come. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Tracy, for that closing session. I have to be honest, I think, every time we get committees to get involved with our webinars, they actually, open up a new agenda. And I have to say, I'm extremely delighted and excited by all the topic that's been covered today. We have, 5 excellent, panelists. We have a very good chair, Tracy, who did a great job. I don't think I would do any justice by trying to summarize all that's been covered, although Bill did ask me to summarize. But what do I pick up? I think, if you go through some of the key messages that came through, it's quite clear. When we talk about digital side of it, we hear issue about digital twins. We talk about drone. Look at data. We are here. Data can be a big player in looking at how our asset is being managed and looking at it from the holistic point of view. I hear from Adrian talking about the society side of it is very important. That we need to look at, how the pandemic, we come out of the pandemic, we look at the resilience, and we look at how the society and the human issue come into it. Everybody is responsible. But what I also pick up was the comment that came to the time is now. A building back is actually something that we need to embrace. I heard from Vijay saying green, procurement is here and policy, we must pursue that. Natalie talks about engineers need to be back at the table. We can influence and we can help to shape the policy. And I do hear profoundly from Lara talking about, taking ownership of this particular agenda. It isn't about just net zero. And Natalie said, let's look at the bigger picture of the SDG. We need to be mindful that net zero is one part of the SDG. There are bigger picture that we need to look at, and we must look at it in a holistic manner. And I just want to close out with the key comment that came from Bernard. He said, look, we need to adapt, we need to innovate, and we need to inspire for the new generation. Tracy, I don't know how best to put this and say the opportunity is right here. And I hear from Bill, that engineer provides solution. It seems to me that the debate that is going on with G7 and the COP26 coming up and our plan to come up with pledge and charter, there seems to be things that we ought to do. The big issue is, what is the role of the engineer? How do we embrace this issue? Comment that came out is, who pays, actually, call the tune. I hear that. We need to get close to those people who are looking at, what I called, green investment bond, and how do we influence them? Because as said by Bernard, these people are really driving the agenda, and they're looking at their children and grandchildren and say, how do we make the world a better place? I just want to close out with one word, which comes from Natalie. The big issue about net zero is just one small part of the SDG agenda. And we as an engineering community, and those who are in the supply chain, and those who are in the legal, and those who are in the technology, we have a golden opportunity to work together to make sure we provide a solution that is holistic. So without further ado, I am actually going to say, we will continue for the rest of this year with our activity in more of our committee activity. more of the state of the world that's coming through, more on the issue about COVID webinar, and more important, there are other things going on within FIDIC, which I want to encourage other people to participate in. I'm just going to finish up with one or two comments to say massive thank you to Tracy for leading this particular debate. I'm extremely pleased the way you've actually coordinated the activity. To Adrena from New Zealand, thank you very much for your input for looking at it from New Zealand perspective. VJ from India, thank you very much for looking at what government is doing. And I hear your word about polar and solar. Lara, you talk about UK experience. Thank you very much for Costain for your input. And Bernard, also for your input on the World Bank. I think your key message about get close to the financier, get close to make sure that at least we inspire is well taken on. And naturally, the key message is so what the SDC is doing is profound. And I'm really pleased that, we're pushing the envelope, even though the SDC team only came into existence about 12 months ago, you're making fantastic project. And thank you very much to you and Tracy for leading this meeting. I just want to close out wherever you are around the world. The issue about net zero is here, and we all have a role to play. And FIDIC is going to continue to chart the way to make sure we are playing our role in doing that. So I just want to finish up by saying, wherever you are, please keep safe and do what is right to be done. Thank you very much. God bless you.